20 seconds of silence. That was all it took. 20 seconds in which a woman who had built her entire political identity on the certainty that the right words would always arrive, discovered in front of 3 broadcast networks and a packed hall that they had not arrived. Her pen was in her hand. Her thumb had gone white around it. Her eyes were moving across the space above the audience, searching for a sentence that the air was not going to give her. JD Vance was sitting 4 feet away in a plain dark suit with his hands resting still on his knees. The posture of someone who has learned, in rooms considerably less comfortable than this one, that waiting is not the same as losing. He did not lean forward to rescue her from the silence. He did not fill it with something easier. He let it do what silence does when a room has stopped breathing. He let it expand until it occupied every corner of the hall. Then he spoke low and almost conversational, into a room that was holding itself completely still. He said, "You told everyone here I was clueless about the world, so let me ask you one thing about it." And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the woman who had never once in her career failed to produce the next sentence, sat there with her thumb white around the pen and nothing coming out. To understand how someone who lived by the microphone lost a room to the sound of her own silence, you need to go back 40 minutes to when she still believed this night was already settled. The Atlantic Security Forum had pulled 3 networks deep along the back wall of the venue, their recording lights burning steady, because word had circulated that the organizers had deliberately placed these 2 on the same panel. The hall was filled past its seated capacity. People were standing against the side walls in the spaces usually kept clear for ushers. Down in the front row, a man in his 30s had driven up from Ohio that morning. He walked with a slight irregularity in his left leg, the part of him that had not come back intact from Ramadi, though nobody on the stage knew this yet, and nobody would until later in the evening. He had not made the drive for the political argument. He had wanted to be in the same room, with someone who had been where he had been. He sat with his hands together and waited the way people learn to wait, when waiting has been a professional requirement. When the moderator recognized Ocasio-Cortez for her opening perspective on American leadership and global engagement, she accepted the floor with the ease of someone collecting something already owed to her. She said she wanted to be candid before the evening settled into its polished format, because she believed the country was owed honesty more than it was owed decorum, and decorum had never been her particular strength. She said she looked across the stage and saw a man who had written a melancholy book about the circumstances of his childhood, leveraged the sympathy it generated to gain admission to a prestigious law school, attached a uniform to the front of his biography, and concluded from all of this that he possessed the standing to speak about a world he had barely entered. She said that was not a record, that was a narrative crafted for a market that was hungry for a specific product. She said the people who celebrated that product, the people whose entire understanding of the world arrived through a truck radio between a church and a hardware store, the people who treated a passport as something that happened to other families, the people who believed that regional loyalty was a substitute for intellectual engagement with reality, those people also deserved honesty. She said the future of this country was not going to be composed by nostalgia and accumulated grievances. She said she represented what that future looked like. She said he represented a well-dressed argument for returning to a past that had not been as good as it was being marketed. She leaned back with the expression of someone who has just placed the final piece of an argument she has been assembling for years. She had just told every person watching on a television in Ohio or Kentucky or the agricultural interior of the country that their life was an artifact, their community was an exhibit, and their instincts were a disqualification. On camera, on purpose. With a thin smile, and she believed she had scored a point. Vance did not react. He had been insulted in more consequential settings and had learned that the person with the most visible reaction to provocation has already established the weaker position. He let her finish. He let the applause she had calculated for fail to arrive at the volume she expected, let it pattern out along one section of the hall and dissolve before it crossed to the other side. He let the subsequent silence stretch one beat past comfortable, then extended it another beat, until the moderator made a small adjustment in her chair, and people in the front rows began wondering if he had processed the remarks at all. Then he leaned into his microphone and thanked her. He said, "I mean that genuinely, Congresswoman. That may be the most candid thing we hear all evening." He let the word candid rest there for a moment, the way you set down a tool you expect to use again shortly. He said he was a slow man from a place that moved at its own pace, but he had always been a willing learner, and she had just offered to educate him about the world, and he would take her up on that. He said he did not reach for any theatrical materials. There was one index card lying face down on his knee that no one had noticed, and he did not touch it yet. He simply asked her some preliminary questions that sounded barely distinguishable from small talk. He asked how she found the international conference circuit. He said travel broadened a person's understanding, and he thought that was genuinely valuable. He asked about her panel appearance at a major security summit in Munich the previous February, whether she had found the engagement worthwhile. She said she found it worthwhile, and the experience had been weaponized by people like him. He said, "I'm not doing that yet. I just want to establish where we are before the ground gets complicated." He said he wanted the record to reflect clearly that she had attended that event as a serious participant in serious conversations with serious people, that she had been fully prepared and fully present, that she was not ambushed or exhausted or misrepresented. She said she had never walked into a room she was not prepared for. He said, "Hold on to that. We are going to need it in about 2 minutes." The trap completed its first quiet inch of closure without a sound. He said he wanted to start with something very small. He said a question had been posed to her that evening in Munich, the kind of geography question they put on middle school assessments, the kind that requires no specialized knowledge and no security clearance and no policy background. Just a general awareness of where things are located on the planet. She had placed Venezuela in the southern hemisphere. Venezuela is not in the southern hemisphere. Caracas sits several degrees north of the equator. The country is not close to the line. It is several thousand miles from qualifying as a close call. The laugh that came was immediate and unstoppable because everyone in that hall carried a general map of the world somewhere in the back of their mind, and they all knew which half Venezuela occupied the way they knew their own street address, without effort or deliberation. It rolled up from the center of the room. A man near the aisle tried to contain it and failed completely. Someone in the fourth row turned it into a cough that convinced no one. And what made it land, with the specific force it did, was not the geographic error in isolation. It was the context. She had called the man sitting 4 feet away clueless about the world in front of 3 broadcast cameras and then demonstrated, in the same evening, that she did not know which hemisphere contained a major country in the Western Hemisphere. She had directed the people of Ohio and Kentucky and the interior of the continent to examine their intellectual limitations from behind a podium at an international security forum, while getting Venezuela's location wrong by the length of an ocean. She did not retreat. She had been in difficult rooms before, and she understood the technique. When the ground shifts beneath you, you do not attempt to hold the ground that is moving. You relocate the entire conflict to terrain where your footing is secure. She pulled the microphone slightly closer, and her voice found its familiar authority, because controlled anger was a landscape she had navigated her entire career without ever losing her way. She said the room needed to understand what was actually happening. She said a working-class woman, the daughter of immigrants, was standing on a platform and being immediately subjected to a geographic quiz by a man who had spent his formative years being lifted by institutional hands, a prestigious degree provided by an institution that responded to the right kind of story, a publishing contract provided by the marketplace for that story, a Senate seat provided by a billionaire's political infrastructure, and then the second highest office in the country. She said every woman in this country who had ever operated with genuine authority recognized this pattern. You wait for the single human error, and you deploy it to retroactively erase everything else the person has ever done, in a way that would never be applied, symmetrically to a man making the equivalent mistake. She said this was not about Venezuela. It had never been about Venezuela. It was about who was permitted to be considered knowledgeable in America, and men like him had spent 4 centuries maintaining the answer to that question. And for a moment, genuinely the room moved with her. It was a practiced and powerful sequence. The reporter's pen was moving fast. A young woman in the third row who had been laughing 15 seconds earlier was now looking at her own hands with an uncertain expression. The current shifted back toward her, and the old trained reflex moved through the hall. The deep institutional hesitation, the instinct to step away from the weight of that accusation rather than examine the substance beneath it. It held for approximately 20 seconds. The person who broke it was not Vance. At the far end of the stage, a man leaned slowly into his microphone. He was a Democrat. He had sat through the entire exchange with his large hands folded in his lap and his head slightly lowered. When he spoke, it was in the level, exhausted tone of someone who has been waiting a long time to say one specific thing and is finally saying it. He said, "I'm going to say this once and then go back to being quiet. I'm a Democrat. I voted with my party consistently for more years than I care to count. My father worked the line. My mother cleaned offices at night. I grew up in a steel town outside Youngstown, and I am not going to sit on this stage and allow you to reach for the working class as a rhetorical tool." When you are in a difficult moment, he looked directly at her. He said, "You say working class like it is a password. The people I come from, the ones who actually operate the machinery, you have never once asked them what they need. You represent them at fundraisers in rooms they could not afford to enter. So do not put on that word to climb out of a hole tonight. Some of us are that word. We do not get to wear it selectively." The trained reflex left the hall. What replaced it was more damaging to her than any counterargument Vance could have made. It was authorization. The young woman in the third row picked her skepticism back up and this time did not set it down. You could feel the permission move through the audience from person to person. The quiet collective understanding that the protection that had surrounded her for years was not a principle. It was a spell, and a Democrat from a steel town in Ohio had just said it out loud in front of everyone. Vance allowed the silence to do its work. He was genuinely skilled at this. The weaponized pause deployed not as a dramatic gesture, but as a functional tool. He took a measured drink of water and returned the glass to the table with a small, deliberate sound. That sound was the most prominent thing in the room for 3 full seconds. He said, "I would let the map go entirely. I want that on the record. A person makes a geographical error under hot lights with cameras running. I've made worse." He said he had once told a room full of financial supporters that he had read every word of legislation that had not yet been printed. His side of the room offered a warm, surprised laugh. He said, "So I am not here to close a career over a country in the wrong hemisphere. That is genuinely not what tonight is about. But you did not call me clueless about geography, Congresswoman. You called me clueless about the world, war, power, what happens in the space after the talking stops. And I was patient about that because I assumed you would walk it back." He shook his head slowly. He said, "You didn't walk it back. So let's discuss the world. The actual one." He turned the index card over on his knee. He did not lift it. He said, "Same conference. Same evening in Munich. After the map, someone asked you the question that actually determines what kind of leader a person is. They asked whether the United States should commit to defending Taiwan with military force if China moves against it. A yes or no question. The most consequential yes or no question an American leader can be asked in the current environment, with the entire international press corps in the room and every allied government waiting to understand the American position. He looked up. He said he was going to read her answer word for word because he did not want to be accused afterward of paraphrasing her or altering her tone. He read it slowly, flatly, letting each hesitation fall exactly where she had dropped it in Munich. You know, I think that this is such a, I think that this is this is of course a very long-standing policy of the United States. He set the card on his knee. He said, 5 pauses, no position, 20 seconds. And then you said you hoped we never had to find out what America would do. That was the answer the future gave to the most important question on Earth on the night the world was listening. Nobody laughed at that. It went somewhere below the frequency of laughter, into the region of a room where assessments form and stabilize and do not easily reverse direction. She reached for the microphone quickly, and the steel was back in her voice, but underneath it was something that had not been present 40 minutes earlier, a quality that sounded like effort, like a person throwing their full weight against something and feeling it not move. She said that is a grotesque reduction of a serious, nuanced position on the catastrophic history of endless American military engagement. She said she was being careful. She said careful was not the same as clueless. She said some people in positions of authority actually engaged in deliberate reflection before committing other people's children to die in foreign theaters. She said she was refusing to produce a soundbite on the most consequential question in geopolitics, and that refusal was not weakness. It was the only genuine form of strength available to someone taking the responsibility seriously. She said, "Senator," he said, "we are past Senator and Congresswoman, I think." The easy warmth had vacated his voice, and what remained was level and cold and very precise. He said, "We were past that 40 minutes ago. We were past it before you stood up and told the people who frame houses and repair engines and pour concrete that their truck radios had made them too provincial to understand reality. I have eaten at those kitchen tables. I was raised at one. Those people understand the world thoroughly. They understand it through direct contact, which is the only form of understanding that cannot be faked or performed or packaged for a conference audience." He let it land. He said, "You want to discuss sending other people's children into military conflict. All right, let's discuss it, because there is one subject in this entire building where I am definitively not the person without experience." And for the first time all evening, something hard and specific entered his voice. Not anger, but precision, the kind that belongs to someone who has been waiting to say a particular thing and has chosen this moment deliberately. He said he had served in Iraq as a Marine in 2005. He said he was not going to wave that in front of the audience for rhetorical points because the men he thought about on evenings like this one were not available to run for anything and were not able to do live streams afterward about how the questions had been unfair. He was not going to give their names. They were not materials for a panel discussion. He paused. The room was completely still. He said, "But I will tell you one thing, because you earned it when you called me clueless about the world." When a leader fills 20 seconds with hesitation on whether America defends an ally, that hesitation does not stay in the conference room. It travels. It has a weight, and someone considerably younger than either of us is the one who has to carry that weight in the actual world, not in the forum about the world. Those are not the same room. They were never the same room. And the person who keeps mistaking one for the other is not the Marine. He picked up the index card. He said, "After Munich, the criticism came down on you." And here's the part he wanted the people watching at home to hear clearly. The loudest and most substantive criticism did not originate from his side of the aisle. It came from Democratic foreign policy professionals from her own party's strategic infrastructure, one of them. And he said he had written it down to get it exact. Said she had demonstrated a complete absence of credibility on international affairs. Her people, not him. He laid the card flat. He said, "So you went on a live stream to clarify yourself. And what you said was that the problem was not your preparation or your understanding. The problem was that the public had become accustomed to a previous president who never thought before speaking, and that expectation was now being unfairly applied to her as a standard." He looked up. He said, "You were asked one question, you could not answer it, and your explanation was that the question was our fault for existing." The room broke completely. Not a polite laugh. A genuine, rolling, involuntary laugh that took the audience over and would not return it for several seconds. The kind that builds because people are partly responding to the content and partly responding to the person next to them responding to the content. The man in the front row with the irregular gait shook his head with a grin that he could not have suppressed under any available circumstances. A reporter 2 rows back laughed, registered that he was on camera, applied visible effort to stopping, and his shoulders continued moving anyway. She had been asked the defining question of the geopolitical moment. She had hesitated for 20 seconds and produced no answer, and her account of why this had happened was that the country had developed an unreasonable expectation of competence. She opened her mouth for the final swing, and Vance raised one hand, not sharply, just enough to indicate he needed the floor for one more moment. He said, "And while we're being honest about the world, let's be honest about the one you actually inhabit." He said she performed the working class with extraordinary skill when the cameras were present and set the performance down when they were not. He cited a rally that spring where she had called on people in progressive strongholds to, in her precise language, pull up on the South, roll up on the red states, geographic regions she had named specifically, including Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee, as though she were summoning something to a conflict. He said she had delivered this from behind bulletproof glass. She had told the people in those states to come toward confrontation, while she stood protected from them by material that cost more than most of her donors' monthly rent. He said, "The people in those states notice details like that. They notice everything. They have to. They cannot afford the glass." A low sound moved through the hall. Harder than a laugh, the sound a room makes when it recognizes something true and specific about a person. He said, and the same season, reporting emerged that she had spent more than $50,000 of small-dollar campaign contributions on luxury hotel accommodations. $50,000 from the $10 and $20 donors, the people who believed the performance was real. The people who thought the coat was actually who she was. He shook his head with something close to genuine sorrow. He said, "I am not the person on this stage who lost track of the working class, Congresswoman. I simply never claimed to be its exclusive representative. You claimed that, and then you stayed in the expensive hotel on their money and told them to go into the street." She gathered what she had left, and she used all of it. She dropped her voice low and let the genuine heat in it carry the words rather than the volume. She said, "You want to talk about where we started? Fine, let's talk about it." She said she had come to this work from behind a bar, running shifts on her feet for 10 hours, taking orders from customers who viewed her as furniture in the room, while men like him were being cultivated at institutions that were specifically structured to produce men like him. She said he had not climbed out of anything. He had been extracted, lifted by the hand of a system that reaches down for boys who write the correct kind of story about their own communities and then leave those communities in the rear view. She said she had learned this country from the floor of it. Not from a book about the floor of it. Not from an adaptation deal about the floor of it. From the floor, with her own feet, over years. She said she had passed legislation that put real resources into the hands of working families in her district, while he was on stage performing a nostalgia act for a town he could not wait to leave behind. She said her district was the most demographically complex in the country, and those voters had returned her to office repeatedly and deliberately against every resource deployed against her. She said he should not sit in his borrowed gravity and suggest she did not understand the world. She said there was a distinction between surviving a thing and studying it from a comfortable remove and calling the studying wisdom. She said that distinction was the complete story of who he was, and it was good. It was genuinely good in a way that had not been present in the hall for the previous 30 minutes. The heat she generated was real heat drawn from real experience, and the room felt the difference. Some of the energy that had been moving away from her reversed. A pen stopped. The current wavered. For 3 or 4 seconds, she held it. Vance let her finish entirely. He let the whole thing land and settle and be absorbed by the room. Then the patience he had maintained for 80 minutes was simply no longer there, and what replaced it was flat and precise and quiet and absolute. He said, "Nobody on this stage is diminishing your history, Congresswoman. You built something real from conditions that would have stopped most people, and I would shake your hand for it anywhere in this country, and mean it completely." He set the index card down on the table between them, face up, where the camera could hold it. He said, "What is actually on trial tonight is simple. You stood on the world stage and could not locate a country in the correct hemisphere. You could not answer the one question every leader on earth is expected to be able to answer. And when your own party said so publicly, you told the country that the expectation itself was the problem." He held there. His voice did not rise by a single degree. He said, "You did not run out of an answer that night in Munich, Congresswoman. You ran out of the honesty required to say that you did not have one." He said, "That is the only thing on this stage tonight that qualifies as inexperienced, and it is not the Marine. 11 words at the end of it, maybe 10. And they did what 10,000 would not have done because they did not attack her. That was the thing people would discuss afterward. He had not called her incompetent. He had not called her a fraud. He had not issued a personal verdict. He had simply placed her own night on the table beside her own explanation of that night, and allowed the two things to exist in the same space, and there was no sentence available to her that could separate them. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked down at the pen in her hand. Her thumb had been white around it for a full minute. Every camera in the hall had found that detail and held it. The small, specific violence of a person gripping the only solid object available when everything else has become uncertain. She was the woman who had talked her way out of every room she had ever been cornered in. She had built an entire career on the conviction that the next sentence was always coming, that the words always arrived, that the microphone was always the safest place to stand. For the first time in front of the country, the next sentence did not come. The silence expanded, 15 seconds, then 20. Her thumb adjusted its grip on the pen. The grip failed. The pen turned a quarter turn in her fingers, traveled the last small distance past her fingertips, and fell. It struck the stage floor and bounced once, a small, bright plastic knock that the floor microphones caught and distributed across the dead, silent hall, like something dropped in an empty building late at night. She did not reach for it. She looked at it lying there on the stage, this ordinary object that had just escaped her in front of the country, and then she folded her hands in her lap with the careful deliberateness of someone arranging the only thing still under their control, and she said nothing at all. The moderator asked, after a respectful interval, whether she wished to respond. Her time had not expired. She did not respond. The clip was circulating before the hall had emptied. Someone edited it to 40 seconds with surgical precision. The map, the 5 hesitations, the Democrat from the steel town, the pen against the hardwood, no narration, no graphic additions, no editorial overlay. Just the sequence in order. By midnight it was on every screen in the country, and the detail that should have alarmed her most was that no one was arguing about it. There were no competing interpretations, no partisan debates, no counter-narratives gaining traction. The argument had concluded before it had a chance to begin. People were simply watching a woman call a Marine inexperienced about the world and then be unable to answer a grade school geography question on a continuous loop, and the loop required no explanation. The evening broadcast led with the image of the pen mid-bounce above the hardwood, 1 inch of air beneath it, caught perfectly by the floor camera. A single network ran it beneath his final 11 words in plain white text on a black background. They added no commentary. The image did not require any. In the marble corridor outside the venue, A journalist intercepted a Democratic congressman who had endorsed her publicly on more than one occasion. The congressman checked the hallway in both directions before speaking and then spoke low and fast. He said, "Everybody saw Munich. We told each other it was nerves. It was not nerves. You can survive being wrong. What you cannot survive is being wrong, and then going on camera to explain that the problem was everyone else's expectation of you. There is no communication strategy for that. There is no statement that answers it." The clip answered it first and permanently. He was gone before the recording device was raised. The man from Ohio drove home in silence. He did not activate the radio. The highway unspooled in his headlights without sound across the state line and into the interior. He had made the drive to be in the same room as someone who had been where he had been, and on the way back he carried something different from what he had brought. Not resolution exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that felt like recognition. Somewhere past the state line, alone in his cab with no one watching, he started laughing. He laughed at the image of the pen bouncing. He laughed at the 20 seconds of silence. He laughed at the image of a woman who had spent the evening informing his community that it was too provincial to understand the world, discovering in front of everyone that she could not locate a country in the correct half of it. He drove the rest of the way home to a place that someone on a stage had characterized as a relic. He did not find it wrecked when he arrived. It looked like what it had always been, the place where people who built things lived and worked and carried things home at the end of the day and watched the news on whatever screen they had. Vance left without lingering. He did what people do who learned their exits in places where extended goodbyes were not available. He slid the index card into his jacket pocket, shook the hands that were extended, and walked out through the side door past the cameras calling his name. He passed the empty chair, where the woman who had never run out of words had sat with her hands folded and nothing left in them. He had arrived with one index card. He left with it in his pocket. He had not needed anything else. There is one last thing worth naming because it carries beyond the evening and beyond the specific people involved. The hall that night contained many people who had been told, through various channels and in various formulations, that their lives and their communities and their instincts and their lack of international conference attendance made them unqualified observers of the world they actually lived in. People who fixed things and built things and drove long distances on their own time to sit in rooms where decisions were made about them. People whose children had been the ones who carried the weight of 20-second hesitations in rooms that were very different from conference halls. Those people watched a woman call a man, who had been to the actual world, inexperienced about it. They watched him wait. They watched him ask one question. They watched the pen fall. And then they drove home to the places that some people on stages consider archives, and they arrived, and the places were still there, still inhabited, still building things, and repairing things, and raising children, and attending every election. The world, it turned out, had always been going to ask the question. The only thing that had ever been in question was whether anyone was going to be ready to answer it. One of the two people on that stage he arrived with a single index card and left with it in his pocket, and the world he had actually been to was still exactly where he had left it, in the correct hemisphere, requiring no correction.